The wind had a mind of its own that morning, low and mournful, scraping through the dry grass like it carried old names it wasn't done saying. The sky was a heavy gray, pressing down on the sandstone ridges until they looked bruised. A lone figure moved among the paddocks. Eliza Wren, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her fingers raw from the cold. She had been up before the light, breaking the thin ice on the water trough, her breath a ghost before her face. The land had turned against her, just as the seasons had, but she worked it still, out of loyalty, out of habit, out of some stubborn need to keep her father's name from blowing away like dust. The sound of hooves came slowly from the ridge. Not the rough, erratic clatter of a cowhand's pony, but something deeper, measured, deliberate. She straightened, heart ticking hard against her ribs. The sun hadn't yet burned through the clouds, and the rider appeared first as a dark shape, framed against the pale rise of the morning. When he drew closer, she saw the gleam of fine leather and the cut of a coat no working man could afford, Colt Abernathy. She'd heard the name before. Every rancher within 3 counties had. Some called him a businessman, others, a vulture who bought dying land cheap and rebuilt it into his empire. His horse was black as pitch, its bridle silver-tipped, and his face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He reined in by the fence, dismounting with a quiet authority that needed no words. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, the smell of earth and straw clinging to her. "Mrs. Wren," he said, his voice low but steady, like a man used to being obeyed. "I'm here on account of your father's debt." She didn't flinch, though her stomach twisted. "He's been gone 2 winters, she said. "I reckon the debt died with him." His gaze was steady, neither cruel nor kind. "Debts don't die easy. Not in these parts. The land is collateral, and the ledger's clear." He drew a folded paper from inside his coat and handed it to her. The writing was neat. Black ink pressed into old creases. Her father's name. Harland Wren. The amount beside it might as well have been a gallows. "I've nothing left to give," she murmured. "Not a horse, not a nickel. You can take the land if you must." Something flickered across his face then, a shadow of thought. "There's another way," he said after a moment. "You work off what's owed. My ranch needs steady hands, ones that don't talk much. A year's labor would cover it." Eliza looked past him to the horizon, where her mother's grave lay under a patch of wild sage. "You'd have me leave this place?" she asked. "You'd have a roof," he replied evenly. 3 meals, honest work. When the year's through, your debt's gone and you're free again. Free again." The words felt strange, like something she'd heard in a story. For a long time, she said nothing. The wind picked up, carrying grit into her hair. Finally, she nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I'll come," she said. He inclined his head. "Pack what you need. We ride within the hour." Inside the cabin, the silence pressed heavy. She moved through the rooms like through a memory, the smell of bread long gone cold, the creak of the old rocking chair her mother once sat in, the worn Bible on the mantel with pages gone yellow at the edges. She placed her father's pipe beside it, then folded her mother's shawl, the blue one with the hand-stitched edges, and laid it carefully on top. She took only the brown wool one for herself. Outside, Colt was checking his horse's cinch. She climbed onto her mare, a faded sorrel whose ribs showed under its coat. He said nothing, only turned his mount toward the trail. The road wound down through the valley where the snow hadn't yet melted. The hooves of their horses made soft, hollow sounds in the damp earth. Eliza kept her eyes on the distant hills, refusing to look back. Yet she could feel the cabin behind her, the ghosts of laughter, of her father's voice reading by lamplight, of a life that had ended before she'd realized it had begun. For a while, neither spoke. Then, near the ridge, she asked quietly, "Do you make a habit of collecting debts this way?" He glanced at her, then back to the trail. "No," he said. "Most don't take the offer. Why me then?" He paused, as if weighing how much truth to give. "Because you're still here," he said simply. "Most walk away before winter does it for them." They rode on. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. She studied his profile, the rigid jaw, the faint scar at the corner of his mouth, the way his gloved hand rested on the reins like he was holding back more than just the horse. There was a quiet fatigue about him, something not born of age but of burden. As the day wore on, the land stretched wide and endless before them. Open prairie fading into mist, a hawk circling high above. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured like a warning. By sundown, the ranch came into view. It was vast, fenced in with cedar posts, and crowned by a big white house that caught the last of the light. A lantern flickered in one window, but otherwise the place looked deserted, like it was waiting to breathe again. Colt dismounted first, tying his horse to the post. "You'll take the small house behind the main barn," he said. "It's warm enough if you keep the stove lit. We start work before dawn." Eliza slid off her horse, her legs stiff from the ride. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of pine smoke and horses. She gathered her shawl close, looking at the long porch, the empty chairs lined against the wall. He turned to go, then hesitated. "You'll find it quieter here than you're used to," he said. "Some folks don't talk unless there's reason to." "I don't mind quiet," she said softly. He studied her a moment longer, something unreadable in his gaze, then nodded and walked toward the house. The door closed behind him with a sound that seemed too final for a place so large. Eliza stood there, the wind tugging at her skirt, and looked out over the fields that now belonged to another man. The lanterns began to glow along the fence line, one by one, until the ranch lay under a hush of amber light. She exhaled slowly, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. This was not home, not yet, but it was where her story would keep breathing, at least for a while longer. And as she stepped toward the small house, her boots sinking into the soft earth, she thought she caught for just a heartbeat the sound of another breath, his carried on the wind. A man not cruel but tired, a man who, like her, had forgotten what mercy felt like until it came wearing another person's silence. The snow didn't stop, not really. It just grew quieter, softer, the way sorrow sometimes does when it's had its say. Days stretched long and gray over Dawson's Hollow, each one bleeding into the next. Smoke drifted from the chimney like a slow prayer, and within that cabin, two strangers learned how to live in the same silence. Clara moved through the place like someone afraid of breaking something that wasn't hers. She mended her skirt by the fire, her fingers raw from the cold, her stitches small and deliberate. When Eli stepped out to tend the stock, she'd drift to the window, watching him move across the yard, broad-shouldered, steady, his coat dark against the snow. He never hurried. Everything he did seemed shaped by patience, or maybe just weariness. The cabin bore traces of another life, what came before her arrival. A woman's life once. Clara noticed it in the small things. A shawl folded on a chair back, a row of jars along the shelf with bits of dried herbs inside, a braid of lavender hanging above the door. The air still held the faintest scent of it, even after all these winters. One afternoon, while Eli was mending the fence line, she found an old brass ring sitting on his workbench beside a pile of worn tools. It was a wedding band dulled by time. She touched it gently, the way one might touch a sleeping animal, and a feeling like guilt bloomed in her chest. When Eli came in, shaking the snow from his hat, he caught her looking. Their eyes met for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, almost absently, "You can keep to that chair by the stove. Floor stays cold till noon." And that was all. Still, something in his tone had softened. By the week's end, Clara began to help without asking. She carried in firewood, patched the draft under the door with burlap, scattered feed for the hens behind the barn. Eli didn't thank her, not once, but he stopped watching her like she might bolt. In the evenings, he'd sit by the window with his coffee, boots stretched toward the fire, and she'd take the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The wind outside whistled through the chimney, and sometimes, if one of them shifted, the old boards sighed beneath their feet, like the house itself was remembering what warmth felt like. They didn't speak much. But now and then, a few words passed between them, small things that carried more weight than they seemed to. "How long's it been since anyone came through here?" she asked one night. 3 months, he said. "Trapper by the name of Wolf spent the night. Said the plains were bare of game this winter. Clara nodded, eyes on the fire. Maybe that's why folks go hungry. Chasing after what won't be caught. He looked at her then. Curious, but said nothing. Another night. While Eli worked on a saddle strap at the table, she asked quietly, "You ever lose something that don't stop hurting?" He didn't raise his head, just kept threading the needle through leather. "Every man who's lived long enough," he said. The words hung there, quiet and honest. Clara didn't answer. She didn't have to. The fire popped once, sending sparks into the dim. At night, her sleep was restless. Sometimes Eli would hear her murmuring through the thin dark, names he didn't know. Caldwell, Boone, Sheriff. He'd sit in his chair by the door, rifle across his knees, pretending not to hear, his eyes fixed on the dying coals. There was a weight in her voice when she spoke those names. Anger, fear, maybe regret. He didn't ask which. Some things a body has to keep unspoken just to breathe. By the second week, the storm had passed for good. The land lay still under a pale sun, the snow crusted like glass. Eli saddled his horse for the ride into town. He needed feed and coffee grounds, maybe a new file for the axe blade. Clara watched him from the porch as he mounted up, her arms wrapped around her shawl. "You'll be back before dark?" she asked, and he nodded once, the brim of his hat cutting a shadow across his face. The trail to town wound low through the hollow and across a frozen creek. When Eli reached the general store, the sound of men's talk filled the place. Low, mean laughter that didn't stop when he stepped inside. "Word is, there's a girl being hunted," one said. A tall ranch hand with red windburned cheeks shot young Boone Caldwell near the river. Sheriff's got riders scouring the flats. Eli didn't look up as he measured coffee into a sack. "You don't say, pretty thing," another added. "Fool too, thought she could hide up this way. Folks say she run off with money, or maybe she just didn't like what Boone asked of her." The laughter came again, ugly, careless. Eli's hand paused on the counter. He tied the sack shut, slow and neat, and said only, "World's full of stories." Then he paid and walked out without meeting a single man's eye. The ride back felt longer than it should have. The wind had changed direction, carrying a scent of pine and thawing earth, but his mind stayed cold. He saw her face again, the raw fear when she'd fallen into his arms, the way her eyes darted toward the sound of distant hoofbeats. It fit now, the shape of her silence. When he reached the cabin, dusk was creeping in. Smoke curled from the chimney. She'd kept the fire alive. Inside, she was kneeling by the stove, stirring a pot of stew that smelled of beans and salt pork. She looked up as he entered, the light catching the bruise still faintly visible near her hairline. "Town's quiet?" she asked. "For now," he said. He hung his coat, brushed snow from his hat. "Storm broke for good. Ground'll thaw soon." "That's good," she murmured, though she didn't sound sure. Eli sat, poured himself coffee, and let the warmth settle through his hands. The silence between them felt different now, not empty but heavy with understanding neither could quite speak. When she finally looked up from her bowl, her eyes met his. "You heard something," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Don't matter what I heard. You're here now. That's what matters." She blinked, swallowing hard, and turned back to the fire. The spoon trembled slightly in her hand. Outside, the wind stirred the snow from the eaves. Inside, the cabin glowed with a small, steady light, the kind that lingers in places long after the past has burned everything else away. The blizzard came down from the mountains without warning, rolling over the valley like a white wall of anger. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of pewter, and the wind rose to a low moan that clawed at the cabin walls. Eli Cutter knew the sound. He'd heard it many winters before, back when the world still held a heartbeat he cared to listen for. Now it was only another reminder of how small a man could be beneath the sky's cruelty. He had just brought the cattle into the lower shed when the snow began to fall in earnest, hard, fast, unrelenting. By the time he pushed through the door again, his coat was sheathed in ice. Clara stood by the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin mug, eyes following him like she was still learning what kind of man he was. "It's coming down heavy," he said. shutting the wind out with his shoulder. "We'll be snowed in by sundown." She nodded, quiet, her lips pale. "Then we're trapped?" He poured himself coffee and shrugged. "Safer inside than out. Let it bury us if it wants. Snow's got a way of keeping trouble away." Outside, the storm roared. Inside, the cabin filled with the scent of burning pine and boiling coffee, the air dense with warmth and the soft hiss of snow against the shutters. Hours passed like that, Eli mending a harness at the table, Clara darning the hem of her coat, neither speaking much. That night, the wind howled like wolves along the ridge. It crept under the door and made the fire gutter, casting their shadows tall and shivering on the walls. Clara sat near the hearth, knees drawn close, her face flushed with firelight. She spoke without looking up. "He wouldn't let me leave," she said suddenly, voice low, breaking the stillness like a dropped stone. "Said I owed him. Said he'd tell folks I let him on if I ran." Eli's hand stilled. The needle hung above the leather strap. "I went for his rifle when he came at me," she went on. "Didn't mean to. Didn't think. Just, he fell. And then I ran." Her breath shook. "They won't care what he did. His pa's got land, money, friends in every town from here to Laramie." The wind battered the roof, the timbers groaning under its weight. Eli set the strap down slowly, staring into the fire. His face gave nothing away, but his silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of a man thinking, remembering. "Sometimes," he said at last, "a thing done to survive still feels like dying." She glanced at him then, eyes glistening in the flicker. "You think I'm wicked?" "I think you're still breathing," he answered. "World don't give that easy." The fire popped. She didn't speak again for a long while. The storm grew worse, its cry rising like old ghosts calling through the pines. By the second night, the snow was piled high against the windows. The cabin walls groaned under its weight, the world outside erased beneath a blur of white. Eli kept the fire burning, his coat draped over Clara's shoulders when the chill bit through the floorboards. She tried to hide her trembling, but he noticed every time she brushed at her hair, every time her gaze flicked toward the door. Near midnight, a sudden pounding broke through the wind, 3 sharp knocks that rattled the boards. Clara flinched, the mug slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. Eli rose slowly, rifle in hand, and went to the door. "Who's there?" A muffled voice came back, half lost to the storm. "Wolf, Jonah Wolf. Let me in, old man, before my blood turns to stone." Eli's shoulders eased. He unbarred the door and pulled it open. The wind burst in first, carrying snow and cold that bit the skin raw. Then came Wolf, tall, wrapped in furs, his dark hair heavy with ice. His face, half Lakota, half white, bore the hard calm of a man who'd lived too long between two worlds. He stomped the snow from his boots, nodded once to Clara, then clasped Eli's arm. "Didn't reckon to find company here," he said, his grin faint. "Storm's bad enough without sending her out to die," Eli answered. Wolf's eyes flicked toward Clara, then back to him. "Storm ain't the only thing coming down." He unshouldered his pack and sank near the fire. Men on the trail below the ridge, 4, maybe 5. Looked like bounty hands. Caldwell's got their loyalty bought in coin and whiskey. Clara went still. Her hand trembled on the blanket's edge. "They found me." "No," Eli said quietly. "They're looking. Snow'll blind them, same as it blinds us. Let it hide us while it can." Wolf stared into the flames, his brow furrowing. "You know what happens when it melts, though." "Word don't stay buried." Eli didn't answer. He just poured Wolf coffee, handed it across the fire. The old trapper drank, his eyes sharp and searching. "You always did have a soft streak, Cutter." "Thought that died with Mara." Eli's gaze lifted, cold and steady. "Maybe it didn't." The room fell silent again, save for the wind and the hiss of sap burning in the logs. Clara sat small in the corner, the blanket pulled high, eyes darting between them. She looked like someone standing on a bridge that might not hold. After a while, Wolf spoke again, softer this time. "Ain't just snow out there tonight, Eli. It's judgment." Eli stirred the fire with the poker, watching the sparks rise and vanish. "Then let it fall," he said. "We'll see who it buries." Later, as the storm raged toward dawn, the three of them sat awake in uneasy quiet, each lost in their own thoughts, their faces lit by the same orange glow. The world beyond the walls was gone, swallowed whole by snow and wind, and yet inside that cabin something fragile began to form. A kind of peace that existed only when everything else had been stripped away. When the fire burned low, Clara finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they come, you don't have to stand for me." Eli looked over at her, his eyes heavy with something she couldn't name. "Maybe I don't," he said, "but I will." Outside, the storm howled on, furious, endless, and alive. But inside the cabin, the air had changed. The cold no longer reached them. The wind might batter the walls, but for the first time in years, Eli Cutter felt the warmth of something worth guarding. The morning after the storm broke, the land lay raw and shining, as if the world had been stripped bare and rebuilt from silence. The snow was deep, glittering like spilled salt across the valley, and smoke from the chimney rose straight into the brittle blue sky. Inside, Clara moved like someone unsure whether she still belonged to the world. Every motion, folding a blanket, lacing her boots, carried the tension of borrowed time. Eli saddled his horse without a word. He said he needed to check the fence line, but she knew he was going into town. His face gave nothing away, though his eyes lingered on her longer than before, a warning, or perhaps a farewell. When he rode off, Wolf sat sharpening his knife by the stove, his dark hair tied back, his expression unreadable. "You think he'll bring trouble back with him?" Clara said softly. Wolf didn't look up. "He'll bring truth. Men always do." By sundown, Eli returned, his coat dusted with frost and a folded notice clutched in his glove. He laid it on the table. Her name was printed in block letters, "Wanted for murder, Clara May Hensley." The words hit harder than any bullet. She stared at them until the ink blurred. "You could have turned me in," she whispered. "I could have," he said. Then after a pause, "Didn't." She looked up, tears burning hot against her cold cheeks. "Why?" Eli set his hat down and poured himself coffee. "'Cause a man ought to know what he's handing over before he does it. And I don't reckon you're what they say." The silence that followed was heavy as snowfall. Clara turned away, hands trembling. "So what now?" "You can't stay," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes weren't. "Pack what you can. Wolf will take you north. There's country up there no law bothers with." She swallowed hard. "And you?" He looked at the floor, then at the fire. "This is my place. My ghosts." For the first time, she saw the weight of the cabin. Not just the wood and stone, but the years, the grief, the worn edges of a life spent holding on to what was gone. Mara's shawl still hung on the chair. The lavender braid still dangled above the door, long dead but not forgotten. Night crept in, painting the world in shades of blue and gold. Clara folded the notice and set it in the fire, watching her own name burn away. "I never meant for any of this," she said, voice breaking. "Most people don't," Eli replied. Later, while Wolf gathered maps and supplies, Clara stood by the window. The wind carried faint sounds, wolves maybe, or the memory of riders somewhere beyond the ridge. She thought of the rancher's son, of the riverbank where blood met water, and of all the miles that had led her here. When Eli passed behind her, she turned suddenly and caught his sleeve. "I don't want to go alone," she said. He froze. The firelight cut across his face, half shadow, half gold. "You won't be alone. Wolf will see you through." "That's not what I mean." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then he gently took her hand from his arm, holding it for a moment before letting go. "I ain't fit for starting over," he said. "Not anymore." Wolf looked up from the hearth, eyes glinting. "You'd ride through hell for her, Eli," he said. "You just don't know it yet." Eli didn't answer. He turned away, jaw tight, and busied himself with kindling. But later, when the fire died low and the wind shifted against the shutters, Wolf caught him staring at her, the way a man stares at something he already knows he's going to lose. Outside, the snow began to fall again, softer this time, quieter. The land slept under its white shroud, but inside the cabin, the air thrummed with what neither of them could say. Clara lay awake long after the others had turned in, watching the orange pulse of the coals. Every breath she took carried the ache of leaving and the fragile warmth of being seen. She didn't know which one hurt worse. By morning she would ride north. But in that moment, beneath that roof heavy with ghosts and unsaid things, she felt something she hadn't in years. Not safety, not yet, but the tremor of a heart remembering how to hope. The morning came grey and heavy, the kind that pressed low on the earth and stilled even the breath of the cattle. A thin fog crawled through the hollows, soft and white as milk, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Eli had been up before dawn, stoking the fire, pouring black coffee into 2 tin cups. Wolf was outside checking the horses, and Clara stood by the window, watching the mist swallow the ridgeline. For a heartbeat, it felt like peace, the kind that makes you forget it can't last. Then came the sound, distant at first, then closer. Hoofbeats. Eli's hand went to the rifle by the door. Wolf came running in, snow clinging to his coat. 5 of them, he said, low and certain. Coming fast, Clara's breath caught. She knew before anyone spoke. The Caldwells had found her. The first shot broke the window, spraying glass across the floorboards. Clara fell back with a cry. Eli shoved her behind the hearth, voice sharp. "Stay down!" Wolf fired through the doorway, his musket roaring like thunder in the cold air. The fog turned to chaos. Horses screamed. Wood splintered. Eli moved through it like a man made of iron, every motion deliberate, deadly. He fired twice, once through the corral post, once toward the ridge. A figure toppled from his saddle and vanished into the snow. Clara crawled to Wolf, who was bleeding from the shoulder, his face pale but his eyes steady. "You need to run," he rasped. "Get her out." Eli shook his head. "Not leaving my land." Bullets thudded into the fence. Clara clutched Wolf's hand, tears freezing on her cheeks. "They'll kill you both for me." "Then we make it cost them," Eli said. He rose from cover and strode into the open yard. The wind caught his coat, snapping it like a banner. He aimed and fired, the old rifle cracking through the stillness. One man fell, another wheeled his horse and bolted. The last came charging, shotgun raised. But Wolf, half-conscious and gritting his teeth, fired from where he lay. The rider tumbled backward into the drift. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of snow melting on hot iron from the gun barrels. Clara stood shaking. The fog thinned, revealing the aftermath. 5 horses scattering, 3 men still as stones. Eli walked toward Wolf and dropped to his knees beside him. Blood soaked the snow beneath the man's shoulder, dark as wine. "Hold on," Eli said quietly. Wolf tried to laugh, but it came out like a cough. "Told you judgment was coming," he whispered. Eli pressed his palm to the wound, eyes fierce. "Then maybe it's past." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of gunpowder and pine. Clara came to them, her hands trembling as she pressed a cloth to Wolf's shoulder. "We'll stop the bleeding," she said, her voice breaking. "You'll see. You'll be fine." But Wolf only smiled faintly. "You both." "Keep riding," he murmured. "World don't end here." Eli met her eyes across the firelight. No words, just understanding. The kind forged in blood and loss. They carried Wolf inside, laid him near the hearth where the fire still glowed. Clara fetched water, tore what was left of her skirt for bandages. Outside the snow began again, light and soundless, covering the bodies, the footprints, the blood. Later, when the worst was done, Eli sat on the floor beside the dead embers, his rifle across his knees. Clara stood over the fire, the bounty notice trembling in her hand. She struck a match and watched the paper curl, blackening to ash. Her name disappeared, smoke rising into the rafters. "I never wanted anyone to die," she said softly. Eli didn't look up. "You didn't make this fight." "They did." Clara turned to him then, the fire behind her throwing gold across her face. "And you stayed." He lifted his gaze, tired but steady. "Couldn't let them take what's mine to protect." Something in the way he said it, quiet, unashamed, rooted her where she stood. Outside, the snow kept falling, smoothing the earth, washing the world clean. Inside, the flames whispered low, and the line between mercy and love blurred into the same breath. By the time dawn rose again, the fog was gone, and the sky burned pale and clear over Dawson's Hollow. 3 graves stood by the fence line, marked with stones. Wolf slept fitfully near the fire, still breathing. Clara sat beside Eli on the steps, a blanket around her shoulders. Neither spoke for a long while. There was nothing left to say, only the stillness that comes after survival, when you realize what it cost and what it gave back. Eli looked at her finally, the light catching the scar on his cheek. "You can ride north when he's strong enough," he said. She nodded, but her eyes said something else, something that neither of them dared yet name. For now, the storm had passed. But in the fire's slow heartbeat, in the hush between them, something new had taken root, fragile, burning, alive. Word spread the way wind carries ash, quiet at first, then everywhere. By the next dawn, every saloon whisper in Dawson's Hollow carried Eli Cutter's name. 3 men dead, gunfire at the old Cutter place. Some said it was murder, others said justice. In the west, it was often both. The snow had softened to slush by morning. Clara sat by Wolf's side, washing the blood from his wound, while Eli stood by the window, the light gray and thin behind him. He looked older than he had 2 days before, though his hands were steady as ever. "They'll come," Wolf murmured. Eli nodded. "I know. You could run," Clara said. Her voice was small but firm. He turned to her, a faint smile touching the scar on his cheek. "A man spends too long running, he forgets how to stand." He set the rifle down beside the hearth and brushed the dust from his coat. "Law's not always fair, but it's still the law. I'll tell him what happened." Clara rose to her feet, trembling. "They won't listen." "Maybe not," he said, taking his hat from the peg. "But a man's got to live clean if he's to live at all." He hesitated, then placed his hand on Wolf's shoulder. "You'll keep her safe." Wolf gave a faint, knowing grin. "Best I can, old friend." Before Eli stepped outside, Clara caught his sleeve. Her eyes shone with a quiet, desperate strength. "Please come back." He met her gaze for a long time, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something neither dared name. Then he touched his hat and said softly, "No man's worth killing twice." The ride to town was long and silent. Snowmelt ran down the slopes like veins of silver, and the air smelled faintly of thawing pine. The town looked the same as always, a few dogs, a hanging sign creaking in the wind, and a crowd that turned when a lone rider came down Main Street. Eli tied his horse outside the marshal's office and walked in. The man behind the desk looked up, broad-shouldered, gray-mustached, the kind of face time had carved hard but fair. "Eli Cutter," he said. "Didn't think I'd see you again." "Didn't plan on it, Marshal," Eli said. "Figured I owed you the truth." The marshal leaned back, crossing his arms. "Word says you killed 3 men." "They came hunting a woman," Eli said. "She'd already been hunted enough." A long pause followed. The marshal studied him. "These men wore badges?" "No," Eli said. "Just greed." The older man exhaled, slow and tired. "You always did have a talent for trouble with a conscience." Eli didn't flinch. "I ain't asking for favor, just for it to end here." The marshal stared at him for a while, then nodded toward a chair. "Sit. Tell me everything." By the time Eli left the office, the sky was soft with the first light of spring. The marshal stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "Those men were bounty riders out of Abilene," he said. "No law lost in them." "You ride home, Eli. World's got enough ghosts already." Eli nodded once. "Thank you." He rode slow on the way back, the thawed ground dark beneath the melting snow. When he crested the last hill and saw the cabin again, smoke curling steady from the chimney, a small shape sitting on the porch, something in his chest eased for the first time in years. Clara was waiting, a braid of her hair coiled in her hands, his old wedding shawl draped around her shoulders. She didn't speak when he rode up. She just looked at him, her eyes bright in the late sun. "Marshall believed me," Eli said quietly. "Believed us," she nodded, her breath shuddering out. Behind her, Wolf's bed was empty, the blanket neatly folded. "He left at dawn," Clara said. "Said he was heading west. Left this for you." She handed Eli a small pouch. Tobacco. A single carved feather tucked inside. Eli turned it over in his palm, his throat tight. "He'll make it," he said. "I think so," Clara whispered. Days passed, then weeks. The snow withdrew into the hills, leaving dark earth and the promise of green. Clara tended the small patch of soil behind the cabin, coaxing shoots out of the thawed ground. Eli mended fences, rebuilt the corral gate. They spoke little, but their silences had changed. No longer guarded, no longer hollow. Sometimes she'd bring him coffee at dusk, and they'd sit on the porch steps, watching the sun bleed across the ridges. Once she caught him watching her braid her hair, his gaze gentle but far away. "Do you ever think she'd mind?" Clara asked one evening, eyes on the horizon. Eli shook his head. "Mara believed the heart's got room enough for what's gone and what's to come. You don't lose one by keeping the other." The wind lifted the ends of her braid, carrying the scent of thawed grass and wood smoke. "You saved me," she said. He took a slow breath, looked at her and said simply, "Ain't no fool in you now." She smiled then. Small and real, and for the first time in years, the hollow inside him filled, not with noise or fire, but with quiet belonging. As spring spread across Dawson's Hollow, the land began to breathe again. Grass pushed through the earth, rivers ran clear, and the cabin that once held only ghosts began to hum softly with life. Eli Cutter, the man who'd stopped believing in mercy, had found it, not in the law or the church or the grave, but in the broken, stubborn heart of a woman who had nowhere left to go. And together, without ever needing to say the word, they began again,